The mystical lies within each of us, and joy is our shared birthright. So join me, Dr. Shimon de Valencia, as we explore the esoteric, the eclectic, and the mystical baths born of our shared search for meaning and the joy that they can bring with each step we take along the way. In the study of the long history of Egypt, as in classical Egypt, it is easy sometimes to become blinded, much as people are in the popular consciousness, into thinking that Egypt is the new kingdom, that this is the Egypt of the Book of the Dead, this is the Egypt of the great giant temple complexes of Karnak. We in fact become blinded to this, not least because the New Kingdom was an incredibly dynamic place, politically as well as philosophically. We can sometimes look back at the old kingdom, but we're looking so far back in many ways that we still only have a basic idea about the ideas and philosophy that motivated the people. Certainly in the Old Kingdom, the focus was very much upon the role of the king, and the king was an absolute authority. And this is reflected in the architecture and the nature of the state itself, as well as the nature of Egyptian religion with its focus upon the king's resurrection, where you as a non-king were able to achieve immortality. It was on the coattails of the Perui Suten, the pharaoh. And really our understanding of the Old Kingdom's idea of mortality, the Old Kingdom's idea of the relationship of ordinary people to the passage of time unto Chech and Chech, unto eternity, is fragmentary at best. But it seems that the idea of the individual was nascent at best during the Old Kingdom. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the birth of the first intermediary kingdom, and the reign of the Hyksos, the complete disruption to Egyptian culture and civilization occurred. And including in this was the complete collapse in the centrality of the pharaoh. Yes, the pharaoh, Peru, or the Suten, depending on which of the kingdoms you were in, the north or the south, was still a religion of deep religious significance. But in truth, there seems to have been an evolution, and this occurred with the dissolution of the Old Kingdom and the collapse into the nomarchs, where regional governors acted very much like kings, claiming the prerogatives of kings, which included the prerogative of resurrection in the afterlife. The Hyksos reign devastated the achievements of the Old Kingdom and the first intermediary period. And so there seems to have been a great fracturing, a crisis, if you wish, but not a terminal crisis. And this is where we come to the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom is brought about by its first pharaoh, Mentuhotep, who was originally a nomarch, but he wages a war and establishes himself as the first pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. His reign was very much one of establishing order, and this becomes a theme in the Middle Kingdom, which is the maintaining of order, the preserving of order, the furthering of order, the active imposition of state power to the preservation of order against the forces of chaos. Now, what has this got to do with mysticism and the mysteries of the other side? This has a huge amount to do, because the empowerment of the individual, the decline of the power of the king as the sole expression of consciousness, of identity, and the recognition that the king and the people are one, is at the heart of the religious revolution of the Middle Kingdom. A feature of the Middle Kingdom is the rise of the cult of Auserr, or Osiris. And of course, with the rising of the cult of Osiris, or Auserr, it becomes the rising also of the cult of Auserr, or Isis. And with this innovation is the beginnings of the idea that individuals, that ordinary people, were able to not just enter into the afterlife, but shared in exactly the same fate as the mighty. This is an idea that's hugely explored in the Sabaite. The Sabaite is the wisdom literature, a feature of the Middle Kingdom. The most famous of it being the disputation or conversation between a man and his ba, or his soul, where a man discusses how difficult life is and painful and what a struggle and the hard work. And his soul turns round and says, but think about this. You crave death as an escape from the pains of life, but with death comes loss. With death comes pain to those you care of. And more importantly, the afterlife will still be there, but that life itself is a thing of beauty and is to be cherished. In many ways, this is an idea that develops, and one which the Greeks learned and took to heart in many ways, which is life is beautiful and life has its own purpose, which is life itself, and that our existence in the afterlife is a second life, and it is determined by what we do in this life. That it's not about how mighty we are and how powerful and how great our offerings are, but more importantly, by what we did with the life that we had. And this is very much a feature of the Middle Kingdom. And it flows on from the fact that kings such as Khepret Senusret II, under whom the text we just discussed was actually written, for example, the greatest feature of his kingdom was the building of an irrigation system which spread farming and spread stability. That these great civic works, not works to preserve the glory of a pharaoh, but works to make life good, not just for the great, but for the ordinary people. And what then happens in the Middle Kingdom is as a result of this, there is this economic growth of the kingdom and the resultant development and growth of a middle class. Not of nobles, but of a middle class. And these people engaging in economic activity which helps Egypt develop into one of the most powerful states in the world at that time, is also funneled into the creation of a literature around which an understanding of the preservation of our mortality after death enters popular discourse and culture. The greatest expression of this are the Coffin texts, a feature of the Middle Kingdom. Whereas in the Old Kingdom, the pyramid texts are our greatest source of understanding of Egyptian theology and philosophy. And in the New Kingdom, very much, we have the great Perem Chru and the Book of the Gates. These are important documents which give us huge insight into the Egyptian understanding of the individual's relationship with eternity and the afterlife. The Coffin texts, which were largely copied from oral traditions which we can trace to the pyramid texts, are written inside the coffins themselves. So they tend to be succinct, short, to the point, but also beautiful. And in them, what we see are the Egyptian people themselves, or at least their intelligentsia, struggling and developing and giving depth to an emerging theology born of the cult of Osiris. A cult wherein which how we live defines our afterlife, but that we are capable of healing and of purification. And it's this innovation of that we as individuals can change our fate through our deeds and through the actions of our hearts, our mouths, and our bodies, or of our hands. We can redeem ourselves from our original nature, which is a blank slate according to the New Kingdom. And we can, if we have accumulated negative deeds, purify them and gain admittance eventually to the Sechet Hotep, the field of offerings, or the field of peace, sometimes called the field of reeds. So, what are features of these texts? Well, one thing is they move away from the celestial focus of the pyramid texts and focus more upon the subterranean elements of the afterlife, which are ruled by Auserr in a place that is called the Duat. And this Duat literature is very much, if not a creation of the Middle Kingdom, a manifestation, and it is perfected. This leads ultimately to the development of the Book of Gates. The Duat is an Egyptian idea of realms of the underworld, very similar to the Tibetan idea of the Bardo. And it is through these duats that we transmigrate, that we move. And it could be argued that the world of this life is a duat through which we move and must master before we can move through gate to the next duat. Ultimately, having purified ourselves and undergone a sacred journey, to then be admitted to the Sechet Hotep, or the field of offerings or peace. And this wasn't just an innovation that was kept secret by the Egyptians. If you actually look at the Greek mysteries, the Greeks themselves said their mysteries came from Egypt. And if you look at the greatest of these mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, their focus is upon a journey through the underworld. This time, however, guided by Persephone and Demeter, wherein one is taught the secrets through which you can pass through and enter into the blessed fields. The Greeks themselves said that this came from Egypt. And as much as the wisdom of many of my colleagues in academia who like to think of this as purely a Greek creation, there is something to be said in taking the Greeks at their word. And so, how did this manifest? Well, there were the mysteries. There were ritual actions of protection and of aspiration, which lead to a blessed existence. Through the use of these rituals and through the use of initiations or of revelations, we undergo transformations and transmigrations of our Ba and our Ach, through which we become purified and thus find liberation from this body in which we dwell at this moment. Example of the text that I personally love very, very much is Coffin text 1130, which is a speech by the sun god Re. And in this he says, "Hail in peace. I repeat to you the good deeds which my own heart did for me from within the serpent coil in order to silence strife. I made the four winds that every man might breathe in his time. I made the great inundation that the humble might benefit by it like the great. I made every man like his fellow, and I did not command that they do wrong. It is their hearts which disobey what I have said. I have created the gods from my sweat, and the people from the tears of my eye." This text contains within itself the core principles of the great spiritual revolution of the Middle Kingdom. That both the gods and humans come from the same source. One might come from the sweat and the other comes from tears, but we both have the same origin. And if we have the same origin, then we have the same nature. But more importantly, the text does not talk about people being created separately, as in the king is a separate being to the nobles, who are separate being to the ordinary folk. But that in fact all are created, and that essentially all, this world exists for all. And from this central idea comes the belief and the formulation of religious and spiritual practice to give expression to that belief, but also to arrive at its fulfillment, is that each individual person and their relationship with order, Ma'at, and the universe is equal. That as much as the gods struggle to preserve order from the universe, from chaos, likewise the king's job is to maintain order against chaos, and that we must also preserve order against chaos. And this order against chaos is a metaphor for the spiritual journey. From it, indeed, the very idea of the spiritual journey grows from this. That life isn't just this brief interlude of bliss and then we enter into the darkness, for only the great and good find eternity. Or that only others can lead us unto eternity. The king may find resurrection and commune with the gods. That is a good thing, but you do as well. And this idea is something that grows, that develops, and from it arises the idea that the deceased, that you yourself are the key to your own liberation and your own resurrection. Coffin text 1031 is not spoken by the god or a king or a priest, but is actually said by the deceased themselves. And the deceased says, I shall sail rightly in my bark, boat. I am the Lord of the eternity in the crossing of the sky. I am not afraid in my limbs, for Hu and Hike overthrow for me that evil being. This is Apep, the snake which represents chaos. I see Lightland and I shall dwell in it. Make way for me that I may see Nun and Amun, for I am that Ach who passes by the guards. I am equipped and effective in opening his portal. As for any person who knows this spell, he will be like Re in the eastern sky, like Auserr, Osiris in the netherworld. He will go down to the circle of fire, and without the flame touching him ever. This is redemption of the individual by the individual. And this manifests around or after the emergence of the cult of Osiris. And the Egyptians themselves sincerely believed that Osiris was a king and who lived. And I, personally, so this is only a theory, have always had the sneaking suspicion that the role of the Buddha, the enlightened, awakened one in Dharma religions, that in many ways Osiris seems to resemble a Buddha. And from the teachings of Osiris, these philosophies of personal liberation become the driving force of Egyptian civilization, of Egyptian religion, of Egyptian mysticism, and one of the true glories. And in the Middle Kingdom, what we see is not just the emergence of the individual, but the emergence of women as players within the field of history. Indeed, the very last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom was a woman who seemed to have reigned in moderate peace. And lots of these coffin texts that we have were paid for by women as much as well as men. And so there seems to have been a growing revolution in the Middle Kingdom. With the rise of the individual, also arises the place of women as individuals. And I do not mean that women were not individuals previously, but I mean as players within the field of history who were worthy of being remembered in their own right, more importantly, named. There are, on some of these coffins, especially in the necropolis of El Becher, coffins that contain graphic representations of the realm of the afterlife, as well as a depiction of the duat, so that this was something that had a concrete reality, not just a philosophical one. One of the greatest of these texts is called the Book of the Two Ways. And this is an example of a map through the underworld, that the underworld stops being an idea and becomes an actual place. And without this Book of the Two Ways, the great books of the afterlife of the New Kingdom are not possible. There were depictions of numerous and various ways, including advice. And there seems to have been a focus on, there was one way which was the way by land, and there was one way which was the way by the water. And that these two paths are separated by a lake of fire. And that if you get lost, you could get trapped in the lake of fire. But if you follow both of these ways, then you will arrive at Rostau, who is the abode of Osiris. And here the judging occurs. And this judging is nowhere near as absolute as people like Wallace Budge like to say, because it was made quite clear that you could, by the enacting of and the speaking of hekau, of words of power, of what people like to call spells, you can enchant your way into the blessed realms. But in this, the term spell is one I really wish we'd get rid of. What is the difference between a spell and a prayer? A spell denigrates the spiritual and mystical yearnings of Egyptians down to incantations instead of the recitations of heartfelt prayers. And if we stop calling these things spells and start calling them prayers, they begin to be seen in the light that truly they need to be seen. And that is as giving expression to the profoundest yearnings of people following a period of great chaos, and the containing within that vision a spiritual vision which is framed around the preservation of order and of peace and the furthering of goodness in the world, of living a good life, and that if you live a good life and rejoice in this life, then you are deserving of a good life and rejoicing in the next world. And if that is not worthy of respect, I don't know what is. So in many ways, these texts and the philosophy behind them are worth reading. If you can read the original texts, they are texts of incredible beauty. Even in translation, they rock the consciousness. We can see how revolutionary these really are. If you have a spare $295.83 US cents, you can purchase the complete edition of the Coffin texts, which includes pictures of the originals. And this is in the famous Arrow Faulkner text, the ancient Egyptian Coffin texts. And this is available through many suppliers, including a certain supplier that sends stuff through the mail. This text is in a print, it's available, and if you can afford it and are interested in this literature, then this is certainly worthy of your viewing. There's, of course, the famous Lichtheim translation, Miriam Lichtheim's Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 1, which does discuss this. And if you're interested in the Book of the Two Ways, Harco Willem's 2019 edition, a fragment of an early book of two ways on the coffin of Ankh from Deir el-Basha, is certainly a good translation and an amazing publication, not least, of course, because this text belonged to a woman. So this text is the text of Ankh, who was a woman who lived during the reign of the nomarch Ahanacht I, and is maybe one of the best of these translations of the text. There is also, of course, Eric Hornung's magnificent text, The Ancient Egyptian Books of the Afterlife. And, of course, the Egyptian Coffin texts, one of my go-tos for my personal reading, which is edited by Adriaan de Boek and Alan Gardner. And this is available through the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. These are all fine editions and translations and are a portal, if you will pardon the pun, into the magnificence of the Middle Kingdom, but also into the living, breathing essence of the cult of Osiris and the revolution that it wrought, which is a manifestation of the Middle Kingdom, which went on to inspire the Greek and the Roman worlds with the celebration of the mysteries, which can be traced all the way back to the mysteries of Osiris in the Middle Kingdom. I strongly recommend these texts to you. And if you have time, maybe read the love poetry of the Middle Kingdom. Certainly, the book of the Conversation of a Man with His Soul is still relevant and fresh. And hopefully this small discussion whets your appetite and opens a door through which you can enter to explore the majesty and the glory of the Middle Kingdom. And the magic and mystery that was and is ancient Egypt.